What's going on, guys? This is Rob. If you guys enjoy my content, make sure you hit the subscribe button and make sure you hit that little bell so you never miss out on my sexy voice. Okay, so we are continuing our discussion on Earth X. And again, like Earth X, God, you guys really seem to enjoy this. I love it too. It's a really, really cool take on like an alternate universe in Marvel Comics. But what this part does is we initially pick up with the Asgardians. Now, this is kind of a cool thing. In the main Marvel universe, the Asgardians are just sort of attributed to gods who exist in a different dimension. And that's really about it. What Earth X does is it makes them a lot more grounded and tangible. Now, one of the big things that people do is they kind of make the mistake of taking the Earth X story of the Asgardians and believing that's the main Marvel Universe story. They're not exactly identical. Instead, in Earth X, what we end up finding out here is that the Asgardians are basically aliens, and they derive themselves from shapeshifters. But the funny thing is that because they were shapeshifters, they had no true identities. They eventually arrived on Earth, and when they did, they encountered humanity, and humanity gave the Asgardians forms. And so it's kind of interesting, because while they are perceived as gods in the eyes of humanity, and they operate as gods in the eyes of humanity, they're actually prisoners of humanity. The story actually hits on the nature of Ragnarok. That's one of the questions that's asked here. Won't Ragnarok be the end times of the Asgardians? But the reason why Ragnarok will exist is not because it's a totally separate set of circumstances that involve Surtur and all these things and will inevitably happen to the Asgardians outside of the fates of humanity. Instead, Ragnarok is defined as the end times of the Asgardians, meaning Ragnarok will come when humanity ends, when the world is destroyed. And the reason why is because when the world is destroyed, humanity will be destroyed with it, and there'll be no one left to give these various Asgardians any real appearance or anything. There'll be no one left to basically guide them on what they should be. And so the result is that they will most likely just kind of self-destruct, or they'll just go on to become something else. But regardless, the Asgardians, quote unquote, will effectively come to an end. And that's kind of the cool thing here. It takes this origin story, it kind of turns it around a little bit, it shifts it around, but everything else remains intact. Thor was eventually banished from Asgard in order to learn humility. Loki was the trickster. Odin was the king of all the Asgardians, all that kind of stuff, you know. It's cool because a lot of that history still remains intact. But at this point, we switch back over to Latveria, basically, to Castle Doom. Now again, because of the fact that Reed Richards had been masquerading as Victor Von Doom, and the Inhumans had arrived back on Earth looking for the husband of Luna, the daughter of Quicksilver and Crystal, what this meant was that when Reed Richards basically left to go find Cerebro, the device that was used by Xavier to locate mutants, suddenly all these Doombots start activating, believing that these people are basically threats, that they're not supposed to be here. And the fight is pretty straightforward. I mean, there's not a whole lot to go on with it, but something that I want you guys to notice here is they don't make any moves towards Black Bolt. It's like he's not there. And the question is initially asked, but the answer is just kind of left lingering. And so at this point, we switch back over to California, to Los Angeles. Now remember, Los Angeles is basically the home of the Skull, this young kid who developed the power of mind control and is working to essentially kind of be the new Red Skull, so to speak, or at least adopted the insignia of the Red Skull and has been essentially consolidating power. Now, because of the fact that he has the power of mind control, what this means is that anyone who just kind of stumbles across his path, any wayward person who travels to LA for whatever reason, will basically be ensnared inside his sphere of influence. And the result is that they'll become his pawn. But in the midst of all this, Captain America is met by the arrival of Daredevil. Now remember, this is a person masquerading as Daredevil. It's not actually Matt Murdock. We'll find out who this person is, but it is cool because this guy basically shows up and simply says, look, I'll join you, Cap, on your mission. I mean, you're gonna fail, but like, I wanna be there to be a part of this whole thing that you're doing. The whole motivation behind this guy showing up, joining Captain America, is that his audience has been stolen from him. That seems to be the only real motivation, but notice it's kind of nonsensical and it's kind of silly, which should give you a little bit of insight into who Daredevil is at the moment. But the other half of this is that Captain America has basically come across a handful of mutants that exist inside of Los Angeles. And so what he actually ends up doing is sending these guys directly over to Cyclops. Now we'll pick up with that here in a second, but at this point, we jump over to the new Sorcerer Supreme, Clea. Now remember, Clea is basically the niece, more or less, of Dormammu, but we're not really told what goes on with Dormammu. We're not really told what's going on with his character or anything like that. What we are told is that at some point along the line, Stephen Strange's spiritual essence had like gone out into, you know, the astral plane, and something had happened where it's believed that his spiritual essence has been destroyed. What this does is it basically leaves his body without a soul. And the result is that Clea was the one who took up the mantle of the new Sorcerer Supreme, and they're just kind of hoping Doctor Strange comes back eventually. But the whole idea of Bruce Banner showing up here with the Incredible Hulk is to basically say like they had a dream. And the dream was that they essentially encountered Mar-Vell of the Kree. Now remember, Mar-Vell was the original original Captain Marvel in Marvel Comics. In Marvel's main continuity, he died of cancer. That was a story that was written by Jim Starlin in 1984, and he was gone. It was a way to write him out and basically try to find a way to replace him with somebody else, which ultimately became Carol Danvers. But the whole gist of this is that he essentially appeared to Bruce Banner as kind of like Eon, more or less, as a cosmic entity. But what Bruce Banner sort of derived from this was that Earth was destroyed, more or less. That, you know, when he looked into Eon and he saw the galaxy or the universe inside of Eon, and he looked for Earth, Earth wasn't there anymore because Earth had been destroyed. And that's what they're trying to find out, is what happened to the planet Earth. Now, Bruce Banner views this as kind of a spiritual message, you know, like Mar-Vell reaching out from beyond the grave to try to warn Bruce Banner of something. And so the whole idea of approaching Clea is to basically say, like, we're looking for passage into the realm of Mistress Death. We want to go to her realm, we want to contact Mar-Vell, and we want to see if he was the one that sent us this message, or if it was just a crazy dream that I had. But it is kind of cool, because in this world of all kinds of crazy things, flights of fancies, you know, and these people with incredible powers and so on and so forth, it makes sense that, like, that would be a legitimate question. Now, at this point, we switch over to, we basically switch over to Thor. This is kind of the funny thing. When it comes to Earth X made a lot of predictions about the future of Marvel Comics in terms of like different characters that we would see. In this story, Thor is a woman. Now, Thor was turned into a chick by Loki. That's the whole basis behind it. It was a trick that was played by Loki on Thor. Now, this also deals with like the storm giants basically invading, and things are taken care of pretty quickly by Thor. And the result is that the Iron Avengers basically go out and do something else. It was a huge trick that was played by Loki to kind of teach Thor humility even after he was on Earth. But the idea is that Thor can never go back to Asgard and tell Odin what happened, because if that were to take place, then the spell of Loki would banish Thor from Midgard for all eternity. He would never be able to come back again. And so it's basically one of those things where, like, I'll stay on Earth as a chick. You know, I'll basically just be a woman here, as opposed to never being able to come back. But at this point, we end up switching over to Cyclops, and the whole idea of Cyclops really staying on Earth, even though he doesn't need to, is largely done because of the fact that he's hunting for Jean Grey. Now, initially, he's approached by like his father, and he's approached by what looks like Polaris and then Havoc, which is basically like a family, so to speak, you know, a family of sorts. But they're kind of like, hey, look, man, we can take you off Earth. It's essentially this idea that like Cyclops could leave if he wanted to, but he's looking and trying to see if there's a way for him to get Jean Grey back. So we know Jean's not dead, but that's kind of like where his loyalties lie. But ultimately, the reason why Jean isn't with him is because she's with Wolverine. In this story, she got with Wolverine, and where we would expect a kind of, you know, maybe like a Bonnie and Clyde kind of situation, or a scenario where like they're off having adventures or they live a really dangerous life. Instead, they have like the crappiest life imaginable. She just sits at home all day long, and like he just drinks beers all day long, and that's it. They just loaf around and not actually doing anything with their lives. But it is interesting to see this take, because for the most part, when people imagine, you know, Jean Grey going with Wolverine, again, like we said, they usually kind of imagine this sort of life where like they're out doing crazy things. We never really imagine them just kind of settling down and their lives going nowhere. But ultimately, what ends up happening is we basically have this point whereby we jump back to the castle of Victor Von Doom, and Karnak hits on a very important thing. Of course, Karnak is a member of the Inhumans who actually never went through Terrigenesis, at least not in the main Marvel continuity. There's no indication that he went through it here in this story, but Karnak's basically very good at like figuring out the quote unquote weakness of things, figuring out the problem with any one particular situation or like a structure or something along those lines. But his line of logic has led him to one inevitable conclusion. It was not the implementation of vibranium that led to like everything going on here. Instead, the only indication here is that this involvement of vibranium is a byproduct of the fact that like it mutated people. Like in Wakanda, for example, it turned Black Panther into like an actual panther, but like that's about it. But that was a mutation that was going on for like decades, you know, before T'Challa ever became Black Panther, and as that was progressing. The issue here is that in a matter of almost overnight, people suddenly develop powers. And so in the mind of Karnak, it has nothing to do with vibranium. Vibranium may have been the catalyst, but it had nothing to do with vibranium. And so that's kind of the mystery here, is if Reed Richards is wrong, if he's basically incorrect about what it was that gave everybody on Earth powers, then the question is, what was it that made this happen? But again, from here, we jump to a bit of history on the X-Men. And that's what's kind of cool about this, is that with each story, or I guess each issue that comes out, you get a little bit of history about things that were going on in terms of what was going on in the past. Now, there are these little backup features that are really more text than actual imagery that kind of tell you what was going on with particular characters. You know, for example, Gambit's dead. Iceman went into his ice form and couldn't go back to being into a human form. And so if he were to leave the North Pole, he would essentially melt. And so he just stays in the North Pole in isolation all the time. I mean, just different things like that. You know, these small little paragraphs that kind of tell you what's going on with other other characters. But the overall idea here is that when it comes to the X-Men, one of the things that's kind of hit on here is the philosophical differences between Charles Xavier and Magneto. Now, a lot of this is just kind of par for the course, you know, for those of you guys who are familiar with the characters, who kind of know what they're about, but it is kind of cool because what this does is it indicates the idea that Magneto's plan to essentially take down the X-Men was a lot more intricate than the way it is in the main Marvel universe. In the main Marvel universe, it's I am the leader of the Brotherhood of Evil Mutants and I'm going to implement this plan, and the X-Men intervene and the X-Men defeat me, my Brotherhood, and I retreat and I do it all over again. But the whole idea here is that it's basically this notion that humanity looked at mutant kind basically, and they saw Magneto as a necessary evil in the sense that with the rise of the X-Men, these various, you know, superpowered beings who were out there by virtue of an X gene, with things like Scott Summers and Jean Grey having a blossoming romance, because of the idea that they would, you know, could conceivably procreate, what it meant was that with the procreation of mutants, humanity would begin to basically fade away. Mutants would begin to replace them. And so because of this, humanity looked at Magneto and simply said, well, maybe Magneto will basically instigate like a gene war. There'll be a war that'll take place among all the mutants and they'll basically destroy themselves, and things will be that simple. And it is kind of cool because that was the plan of Magneto in a lot of different ways. The plan of Magneto was sitting down and realizing that Charles Xavier's dream of a peaceful coexistence was too good for a lot of people to ignore. And so what Magneto did is by playing the villain, he made Charles Xavier into the good guy. And the whole gist of this is that as the good guy, Charles Xavier has to walk the good guy path. And what that means is the first time he fails, the first time he falters, the first time he makes a mistake, suddenly everybody's on him. Well, he's not the good guy anymore. He's just as bad as Magneto. And if he's just as bad as Magneto, then why not just go join Magneto? That was the whole idea. It was pretty intelligent and pretty smart the way the whole thing worked out. But again, Reed Richards is kind of visiting what's left of the Xavier Institute, which has long since been in shambles, essentially grabbed Cerebro for the purpose of going through and examining everything and trying to figure out if there's a way for him to basically locate the Inhuman gene, more or less, and then allow the Inhuman family to sort of rise to prominence again, and then all the Inhumans on Earth to leave along with the royal family. That's really kind of the immediate purpose that he's serving here. But then we switch over to Cyclops himself, and this is cool because what we end up finding out is the small band of mutants that Captain America had run into in Los Angeles were rounded up by Captain America and sent to Cyclops in order to be trained. But notice this, Cyclops is initially adverse to it. I mean, all these guys basically attack him all at the same time, and that was just designed to say, hey, look, here's how far we are in our training, here's how advanced we are. But like Cyclops doesn't really want to train these guys. I mean, he does, but basically he doesn't want to fall in line of being Charles Xavier, because in his mind, it's repeating the same thing that happened before, that like people are going to gain power, you know, people will have power like they had before, but training these people on how to use their powers would basically train them on how to use their powers so they could use them nefariously. They could walk away and become villains, more dangerous villains than they were before they met Cyclops, any number of these various circumstances that could arise. But ultimately he ends up going with it just because of the fact that it gives him motivation, it gives him purpose. Notice this, for a lot of the older people who were here, Captain America, Cyclops, these guys, it's doing what they can to latch on to the last vestiges of what they remember from like the way things used to be, hoping things go back to the way they were before, clinging to the past, unable to look into the future. And so what we end up doing here is jumping back over to the whole idea of Bruce Banner and the Incredible Hulk and all these guys basically trying to find a way into the realm of Mistress Death. Now, one of the things that's kind of hit on here when it comes to Clea is that Mistress Death, as she exists here, is a lot more evil than she exists in the main Marvel universe. In the main Marvel universe, she toys with people, but it's one of those things where like she's willing to barter. There's been times where Mistress Death has actually allowed souls to leave the realm of the dead if she gets something in return of significance. In this, it doesn't work that way. In this, it's once you're in the realm of the dead, you're in there forever. And if you go walking into her realm and you have a soul, she'll take it and you'll literally just be stuck there for all eternity. You'll never be able to leave. She'll never let you leave. So she seems very vindictive, very evil, you know, very, very cruel and cynical. But the whole idea is that Bruce Banner basically says send the Incredible Hulk in there. And on the surface, it seems pretty cold-hearted. But this is when we find out that the Incredible Hulk is basically the soul of Bruce Banner. I'm sorry, Bruce Banner, I guess, is the soul of the Hulk. And so it's basically this idea that like the Hulk is its own entity. It can think, it can feel, different things like that. If it goes into the realm of Mistress Death, as long as Bruce Banner's on the outside, then like there's no risk of stealing the Hulk's soul because the Hulk's soul is on the outside. It's in the form of Bruce Banner. And so it's the best way to get somebody in there to figure out what's going on. The problem with this is the Incredible Hulk's not the sharpest tool in the shed. Now, Banner believes that he's basically managed to reconcile this information by essentially like writing to the Hulk and basically like giving him a message in a bottle, so to speak, so that when the Incredible Hulk is there, he can crack this open, he can examine it and basically take a look at things and just sort of figure out what's going on. But at this point, we switch over to Cyclops sort of training these X-Men to a degree. It's a small moment, but again, he's kind of stepping into the role of Charles Xavier. He prefers to be called Mr. S, but he's stepping into the role of Charles Xavier. That's basically what he is now. He is a person who has stepped into the role of a leadership capacity by circumstance, not really by actual choice, but he's maintaining this choice in the end. That's really kind of the motivation motivation behind it and the basis behind it. So it is cool. But what we end up doing is basically following up with Captain America and Daredevil while they're essentially racing, trying to stop this mob of people from like getting to New York, basically trying to control the sphere of influence of the skull. But the way this ends is essentially them just like going into a tunnel. That's really about it. But what Daredevil basically hints at is that he can be dismembered. He can be taken apart piece by piece and then reassembled again, basically heal himself. So again, gives us a little bit of indication who Daredevil is in the Earth X universe, but it is cool. The ending is a little lackluster from the ones that we've seen before, but it still stands on its own 2 feet and it's still pretty solid. I mean, it's more just kind of like world building than anything else. But with that being said, guys, we're gonna go ahead and bring this video to an end. If you are new here to Comics Explained, make sure you guys hit the sub button to become part of the Rob Corps. If you guys enjoy this video, make sure you drop a like, and I will catch you all later. Peace.